Hi, this is Clayton Cahan Lust. This is History 1301, United States History 2, 1877, and this is Lecture 15, Manifest Destiny, Mexico and Texas. We're going to be talking a little bit here in a couple of minutes about the idea of manifest destiny and what it has to do with Texas. But before we get to that, we're going to start off with a little sort of art history lesson, if you will. The painting that's on the screen is a painting called American Progress by John Gast, and it sort of exemplifies what's going on during the 1840s and 1850s with something called manifest destiny. The idea that something is our manifest destiny, or anything is a manifest destiny, is the idea that it has been sanctioned by God. It's something that God has proclaimed, this is what is going to happen. And we can see this in this painting simply by the angel leading the country westward. The angel is the messenger of God. In the right hand, the angel is actually carrying the Bible. And what the idea of manifest destiny held was that as the United States moves westward, it brings progress with them. So if you look behind the angel, the area that is to the east, you can see that the painting is a little bit brighter, that there is much more sophisticated and advanced technology, while facing forward, what she's going into is darkness. It's an area that's under the control of more primitive people, or Aboriginal people, in this case, Native Americans. It's dominated by older technology like covered wagons and mining and the like. It's not the same sort of country behind her as is facing in front of her. So there's a progress that's happening as the United States goes forward. So this idea of manifest destiny isn't just that we move from east to west, but it's that we bring progress with us. We civilize the uncivilized. We bring advancement where there was a distinct lack of advancement. Now, we're going to start off with Texas, because Texas is one of the first places where we implement manifest destiny in this country. And very few historical events are as shrouded in mystery and myth and legend as Texas, the Texas Revolution, and the story of the Alamo are. For 12 days at the Alamo, Mexico laid siege to the beleaguered mission. On March 6, 1836, Mexican soldiers scaled the walls at the Alamo, and 3 hours later, the battle was over, and all of the inhabitants inside were dead. 2 weeks later, at a battle called the Battle of Goliad, Texans found themselves surrounded again by Mexico's forces, and their leader and their military leader and president, Juan Antonio Lopez y Santa Anna, ordered the execution of all 350 of the captive Texans. These two defeats have been credited with galvanizing Texas's resolve and enabling the Texas Revolution to succeed. But the reality and the irony is that these defeats, while they were thorough and utter defeats, they actually took more out of Santa Anna and his men than he should have expected. They slowed him down, and this is what gave the Texans, under guys like Sam Houston, the ability to train an army that was capable of going out and fighting against Santa Anna. Now, the army that Sam Houston wound up training consisted largely of slaveholders from Tennessee. In April of 1836, Houston's army surrounded Santa Anna at the Battle of San Jacinto and defeated him. They forced Santa Anna virtually at gunpoint to sign a treaty that granted Texas its independence. However, to give you an idea of how seriously the Mexican government actually took this treaty, the Mexican Congress actually refused to ratify the treaty. They had very little use for Santa Anna. They thought Santa Anna had finally proven that he had gone too far, that he was completely useless to them. So even though they've got no use for Santa Anna, they also believed that this treaty was unreasonable, and there was no reason for them to actually ratify all of this. Now, if we look at what pop culture has done with the story of the Alamo, with the Texas Revolution, and the like. Hollywood has turned this into a very sort of black and white story, if you will. For example, the ideas of good and evil are portrayed very simply. The ideas of right and wrong are portrayed very simply. They can be seen in the way the Texans are portrayed as people who are defending themselves, while Mexicans are portrayed as invaders. That's also a very simple piece of a dichotomy that's played out in this story, that it's Mexico on one side and Texans are on the other side. The reality, though, if you'll allow me to flip back a slide here, is that it's not as simple as all Mexicans are on one side, all people who were Texans are on the other side. Of the 186 who died at the Alamo, at least 7 of them were Tejanos, meaning that these were people of Mexican descent who were born in Texas and fought for Texas's independence. So it's not as black and white as, quote, Anglo-Texans on one side and Mexicans on the other side. We can see some of the complexities in the way Hollywood plays this out as, again, Mexico, quote unquote, versus these other forces. The real story of the Alamo pits Mexican against Mexican. Santa Anna's army was 3,000 men strong, to be certain, but it wasn't really quote-unquote Mexican in terms of this sort of Spanish sanitized version of Mexican soldiers. Of those 3,000 men in Santa Anna's army that besieged the Alamo and then later on fought at Goliad, the bulk of it was made up of Mayan conscripts. So these were indigenous people who were fighting for a different type of Mexico. These people spoke virtually no Spanish. They were not wearing Mexican army uniforms. They were very poorly equipped. So it was hardly the ideal of Mexico, quote, fighting to keep Texas. So the question becomes, with all of this complexity, with all of these different ideas, with a lack of a clear, it's one side against the other, why is all of this happening? Why is the Texas Revolution developing? Well, the people who were fighting in the Texas Revolution were people who were largely divided by class. It's not divided by national origin. It's not divided as much by nationality. It's not divided by race. It's mostly divided by class. There was an upper class who supported Texas independence, and people who were upper class Mexicanos tended to support Texas's independence, in large part because they believed that slave-grown cotton was the key to Mexico's future. It's the key to Texas's future and thus Mexico's future as well. And in Texas, when they bring all of these slaves, Mexico wound up having a real problem with all of this and tried to abolish slavery in the then Mexican state of Texas. Now, these people who had favored bringing in all of these Anglos to grow cotton favored Anglo immigration, they favored a separate court system, and they favored a separate political system. Now, if we read in textbooks about the Texas Revolution, one of the things you'll read in virtually every textbook is that it is partly about self-determination. It's partly about unfair taxation. It's partly about a quote-unquote corrupt Mexican government. But there's something that's almost always skipped, and that something that is almost always skipped is slavery. People often forget the importance of slavery to the foundation of Texas. Even in Mexican Texas, slavery plays a huge role in the foundation of that part of Coahuila y Tejas, which was a separate state within Mexico's federal structure. Texas was founded on the ideas of slavery. Now, To understand how it plays out, we've got to actually step back a little bit to the era of the 1820s when Mexicans had been revolting against Spanish rule here in the so-called New World. The Spanish Empire had very little success against these indigenous rebels that made up or will make up what's called Mexico. And they began encouraging Anglos to emigrate to Coahuila y Tejas in part to kind of form a buffer, and to form a buffer against Native Americans, to form a buffer against these indigenous peoples who wanted independence. But even after Mexico won its independence and you have a separate Mexican government, they too wind up encouraging Anglos to move to Texas. They too understand that these Anglos who are coming in can serve as a buffer against Indian tribes, particularly Comanche Indians. But the main reason they continued to encourage this was that those Mexican rebels turned into a Mexican government, understood that cotton cultivation was extremely profitable. Since it was profitable, it would generate taxes that would allow the state to develop in Mexico. So they understood, bring these people in, have them grow cotton, we will profit. Now, the Anglos that move in, the Anglos that come through this emigration, aren't just any Anglos. They are primarily Anglos from the American South, from the southern parts of the United States. And when they come, knowing full well that they're going to be growing cotton in places like East Texas, when they come in, they bring slaves with them. At least one out of every 5 emigres to Texas brings enslaved people with them. Now, a problem develops over this because while at least 20% of them do in fact bring slaves with them, Mexico also developed an abolitionist movement. Just like the United States had developed an abolitionist movement, Mexico also developed an abolitionist movement. The big difference here, though, was that Mexico's abolitionist movement was actually successful. It succeeded in getting slavery abolished in 1829. Outraged, Texans sent various representatives to Mexico City. Chief among them was Stephen F. Austin, who argued that the banning of slaves in Texas had violated the provisions of their land grant. In fact, Austin got so angry about this and so vociferous about it that he wound up being thrown into jail. But ultimately, what the Mexican government did, they threw him in jail because he was just bad-mouthing and everybody. But they didn't disagree with him. And ultimately, what Mexico does is they create a loophole for Texas. Now, what I mean by this loophole is the loophole doesn't actually reestablish slavery, but what it does do is it allows those Texas slaveholders to convert their enslaved to indentured servitude. Now, those indentured servants are going to be serving 99-year terms of indenture. So they're not really that different from slaves because they're not going to make it through a 99-year term of indenture. Now, to give you an idea of how important slavery was here, let's take a look at the population, the basics of the population in Texas according to the 1830 Mexican census. There were 20,000 Anglos who had lived in Texas who had brought with them 4,000 slaves. And then already living in Texas were 4,000 Tejanos, meaning people of Mexican ancestry who lived in this area. So the issue of slavery was always a critical part of Texas. It was always a major piece. Now, things started to devolve in December of 1835. In December of 1835, Juan Antonio Lopez y Santa Anna seized power in Mexico and became dictator of Mexico. Now, a lot of people did not have a problem per se with Santa Anna becoming a dictator. Santa Anna was one of the legitimate heroes of the Mexican Revolution, the revolution that established Mexican independence from Spain. And especially since Santa Anna always said that the dictatorship was a temporary step toward establishing a federalist type system that was modeled on the US's own system of federalism. So a lot of people looked at Santa Anna and said, yes, he seized power, but his end game is actually something that we can get behind. Except when it came to slavery. Okay, now Santa Anna abolished the states, quote unquote, but he always said he was going to do that. He said, we're going to abolish the states so that we can dismantle the power of the individual states. And ultimately, we're going to reassemble the states within that new federalist structure. So that's one thing he does right off the bat, is he abolishes the states. But the other thing is Santa Anna was also a lawyer. And Santa Anna said that the old Mexican Constitution will not work. And he tears it up and says, we are no longer bound by this Constitution, and I am going to write a new Constitution. Now, this is a sort of provisional Constitution, if you will. It's meant to be a temporary governing document. But what bothered people from Texas primarily was that this new Constitution, this provisional Constitution, abolished slavery again and did it with no loopholes, with no exceptions for anybody, including those, quote, 99-year terms of indenture. So Santa Anna says, I'm not playing around. I'm not recognizing that that's, quote, not slavery. He says slavery is over. You guys have to free your enslaved people or your, quote, indentured servants. Now, almost immediately upon Santa Anna's passage of this new constitution that ends slavery, Texas secedes from Mexico. They declare their independence from Mexico, and they also get together and put together their own provisional Congress, which will adopt as one of their first new laws a law that bans free blacks from the new nation. They do not want free people of color living in Texas. They also put together a provisional constitution that was very similar to the old Mexican Constitution, with one exception. It specifically legalized and protected slavery. Now, despite what you hear from all of these people who talk about the glorious history of the Republic of Texas, the glorious history of that republic was actually Plan B. Plan A was annexation by the United States. As soon as Santa Anna granted independence to Mexico, the new, quote, Republic of Texas sent a, quote, minister plenipotentiary, that's basically an ambassador, named Mirabeau Lamar, to the United States specifically to ask the United States to annex Texas as a slave state. Now, the only reason it didn't happen, the only reason Texas didn't get annexed, is that John Quincy Adams, the former president of the United States, had actually returned to Congress as a member of the House of Representatives, and he staged a 36-hour filibuster to kill the piece of legislation that would have brought Texas in. Ultimately, what the Congress instructed Mirabeau Lamar was, they said, the issue of Texas's independence is not entirely settled. We believe that Mexico still possesses a claim to Texas, so once you've resolved that, apply again, because we don't want to go to war with Mexico. So Plan B is ultimately enacted here. The United States does not wind up taking Mexico. They do not wind up annexing Mexico, and Texas becomes an independent republic for the next 9 years. And over that 9-year period, heading toward 1845, more and more people start moving to Texas. More and more people start moving slaves into Texas. In 1845, Texas winds up being annexed by the United States. And again, more and more people start moving westward, so that by the time the Civil War rolls around, slavery is actually even more prevalent in Texas. If you remember back to the 1830 census, if we add all of the quote-unquote Anglo-Texans, all of the Tejanos, and all of the African slaves. Slaves make up 1 out of 7 in the population. But here in 1861, the slavery population is 1/3 of the state of Texas. So anybody who argues that slavery was not important to Texas or slavery didn't exist in Texas, it's simply nonsense, and that person does not know what they are talking about. Now, once this is all happening, once Texas is part of the United States, it becomes clear that Texas is only a small part of a much broader effort to expand the United States. In 1830, for example, according to the U.S. Census, only 130,000 people lived west of the Mississippi River. But by 1849, that's less than 20 years later, quote unquote, all of the United States, all of the West, belonged to the United States. Places like Texas, California, all of the Pacific Northwest, all of the upper Midwest and beyond that to the west, all of that stuff is part of the expansion efforts, and a successful expansion effort, no less. And the question is why? Why are Americans so keen on expanding? Now, the first obvious answer that historians always give is land hunger, that people always want access to more and more land. And that is true. There is a distinct land hunger in the United States, but it's certainly not the answer, because there was lots of unsettled land in the United States at this point, especially east of the Mississippi. There's still a ton of land. West of the Mississippi River, there's just an unbelievable amount of unsettled land, because the United States had done a couple of surveys, but nobody had basically moved into the West yet. So, land hunger is not really, quote, the answer. Missionizing is certainly a possibility. There were at least 500,000 Indians who lived west of the Mississippi River. So that meant 500,000 potential souls that could be saved by Christian missionaries. So, missionizing certainly could play a factor here. Ethnocentrism certainly plays a factor. Anglos who thought about moving west believed that they could exploit the resources in the West on a far greater level than Native Americans could. For example, people who started heading toward the West looked at the Great Plains, for example, and saw that in the spring, the rains that happened in the spring produced 6-foot high grass, just this tall, wild grass that grew irrespective of animals grazing on it, that grew without fertilization or anything like that. And Americans looked at this and said, this soil is incredibly productive. We could grow anything on this soil. It turned out they were right. It was incredibly productive. But they looked at it and said, well, why are the Indians going out and hunting buffalo instead of farming? And they concluded that it was that the Indians were too lazy to exploit the resources. Now, that's certainly an ethnocentric way of viewing it, looking at it through blinders that are shaped by your own culture. So Americans are looking at this and saying Native Americans are not exploiting this because they're lazy, and they add to this something that they thought all the way back in the 1600s. They thought because they said they added to this, because the Indians are not exploiting it, they do not deserve this land. God will give this land to us. It's our divine providence, if you will. Geopolitics also play a major role in why there's all of this move toward expansion. The thought is, by American policymakers, that this is a necessary preemptive move against foreign settlement. Now, the United States already controlled everything east of the Mississippi River, south of Canada. They also controlled a massive swath of territory that was the, quote, Louisiana Territory that stretched all the way from the Gulf of Mexico to North Dakota and Montana. But the so-called Pacific Northwest, where Washington State, where Idaho, where Oregon, where all of that stuff is, that was still up for grabs. That did not belong to the United States. The Mexican government made a sort of tangential claim. The British made a tangential claim through Canada. And there were also people who genuinely feared that because the Russian nation controlled Alaska, they might actually sail down the Pacific coast and put in at places like present-day Washington and stake a claim there for themselves. So the thought was, we need to get there before anybody else does. So geopolitics plays a role here. And then certainly the ideology of manifest destiny, the idea that God has ordained that all of North America should be settled and controlled by Americans. This is a huge factor. Now, a lot of people, when they think of manifest destiny, think solely of an east to west movement, that we're destined to control all of the stuff from the Atlantic to the Pacific. But those who took this ideology to its greatest lengths also believed it's not just east to west, it should also be north to south. So they believed that everything in Canada by rights belonged to the United States. Obviously, the continental United States belonged to us, and they believed that Mexico and South America should also belong to the United States. Now, the one thing that we have not mentioned yet, again, just like all these other times that we've forgotten to mention it, quote unquote, slavery. Slavery plays a huge role in all of this. The South and the North were in equal balance in the Senate. But if you remember when we talked about the Missouri Compromise, there was plenty of room in that old Louisiana Territory. It's old now. There's plenty of room in that to create new states, and very little room for, quote unquote, slave states. So what this did, this is an odd thing that happens after the Missouri crisis. Southerners, should be obvious to you, this should not be a surprise to you at this point, that Southerners believe in states' rights, that the state interests, the local interests, supersede the national interest. But Southerners were also very much committed to national expansion, because national expansion was the only way there were going to be more slave states added. And with national expansion comes a lot of stuff that states' writers just don't like. Things like a larger military, the need for national programs that will allow for the expansion to happen. It means taking people from other states and bringing them in and putting them in as part of the mission, as opposed to, say, leaving it up to an individual state. So states' writers are, oddly enough, in favor of all of this stuff that is typically counter to a states' rights narrative. Now, the American strategy for how we carry out this expansion is to put facts on the ground, to use a modern phrase. The idea that you send in pioneers, you send in so many settlers that ultimately they'll outnumber the natives, and those areas will become American by default. Now, it doesn't ever work well when you try to do that. That's why there was a revolution here in Texas. That's why there developed revolutionary movements in places like California. That's why when the war with Mexico begins, places like Santa Fe, New Mexico, even though they are quote unquote American in regard to having lots and lots of people there, the indigenous people reject that type of control. So it doesn't always work out. But the first place we're going to see it is Texas. And as I mentioned, Texas, they try to go through this. They try to send that minister plenipotentiary here, and it doesn't work. So rather than try to continue the role or the plan of putting through another piece of legislation and try it, after this, when Texas embarks on this republic period, the South comes up with another answer. They create a conspiracy around the issue of Texas. In 1840, as we've already talked about, William Henry Harrison, the man pictured on the top of the screen here, had become president. He had been an Indian fighter. He was considered a genuine hero because he'd opened up the Ohio Valley to white settlement. He was a member of the Whig Party, which was a very odd mishmash of different groups like reformers, people who opposed Indian removal, people who favored women's rights, who agitated against slavery. It was considered to be the party of the educated and the professional element of society, but it also had this weird conservative element led by people like John C. Calhoun, who genuinely favored slavery and the use of slavery in national expansion. Now, the Whig Party, as you should remember from a couple of lectures ago, was a relatively new political party at this point. And Harrison, as the head of that party, looked at Texas and said, Texas is a fractious issue. It's something that is ultimately going to divide the country. So, as a matter of keeping the Whig Party together, William Henry Harrison came out in opposition to Texas's annexation. Now, to be clear about this, Harrison generally probably favored Texas's annexation. If he were to look deep in his heart, he probably would have thought it was a good idea. He opposed it strictly for political reasons. It was about keeping the Whig Party together. But you should also remember that William Henry Harrison gives this incredibly long inaugural address in a freezing rainstorm, contracts pneumonia, drops dead. And the new president of the United States is his vice president, John Tyler. For the first time in our history, the vice president ascends to the presidency. Tyler, like a lot of previous presidents, owned a lot of slaves, and slaveholders were kind of at the top levels of government in every part of the government. And Tyler genuinely favored the annexation of Texas as something that would preserve the power of slaveholders. But again, he knows, he's not stupid. He knows that trying to force Texas's annexation is likely to cause a problem, just like it did in 1836. So they manufacture a conspiracy around all of this. The conspiracy is this. They argue, they claim that Great Britain is trying to turn Texas into a British settlement. Now, according to Tyler, and according to Tyler's people, Great Britain was promising an incredible amount of money to Texas if Texas would simply abolish slavery. Now, there is not one thimble's worth of evidence that this was going to happen. It simply did not exist as a real possibility. But in order for a conspiracy to work, for it to gain credence with people, it doesn't have to have a ton of credibility, just enough of a thin shred of credibility to make people go, well, I don't know, maybe. So, zero chance it was going to happen, but there is just this little thin shred of credibility. Here's the thin shred. By 1838, Britain had completed abolition throughout the entirety of their empire. So no question, Britain was now a nation fully committed to abolition. There's no doubt about that. They also had a very vocal group of abolitionists who were private individuals, private citizens, who did go around and literally raise money for the purposes of trying to convince people to abolish slavery, to free their slaves on an individual basis. But that is a far cry than a concerted effort by the British government to do something like that. There were private British citizens who were doing this. But the British government was not doing all of this. The British government had no interest in doing this. In fact, their foreign secretary said of Texas, "It's none of our business. It does not affect us in any way." So, government is not involved in this in any way. But this idea that Britain might be trying to do this scared a lot of American slaveholders. They looked at this and said, well, if Texas ceases to be a pro-slavery, quote, nation, if slaves know that by running away to Texas, they will be able to escape slavery via an international boundary, we're in real trouble. This is something we cannot have. And for those in the United States who said, well, you know what? If British citizens want to give people money, or even if the British government wants to give people money and try to end slavery, I don't like slavery, I don't care. The administration under Tyler had another argument for them. For those who didn't care about that stuff, there is a very strong foreign policy consideration in the Monroe Doctrine. The Monroe Doctrine is our basic foreign policy statement of this era. And the Monroe Doctrine, if you remember back to the previous class, stated that countries that are trying to colonize or affect politics in this hemisphere, the United States will consider that an act of war. So Britain probably wasn't ever, even these abolitionists weren't interested in creating a British colony. But that interference was enough for Americans to go, oh, no, you're interfering here. You're violating this Monroe Doctrine. So even people who didn't care about slavery at all could point to the Monroe Doctrine and say, this is not acceptable. All right, that's one area. So Texas is one area, and it becomes pretty simple. And we wind up annexing Texas very quickly at the end of 1844 and the end of 1845. The next area of contention is the Pacific Northwest. In 1844, the United States elected a guy named James K. Polk, pictured on the board here, or on the screen here. They elect him as President of the United States. Now, he had run for the presidency with a campaign slogan of 5440 or fight. And that referred to 54 degrees 40 north latitude. 5440 or fight. Or 5440 represented the southernmost border of Alaska. So what Polk was saying is that everything south of Alaska belonged to the United States by rights, and we are going to be willing to fight to maintain it. Now, a lot of Americans bought into Manifest Destiny and thought, this is a really tough character for the United States. He really has America's interests at heart. And there were a lot of Southerners who looked at this and said, Polk is one of our guys. This doesn't make a whole lot of sense. Why do we care about Canada? And to be clear, Polk didn't care about Canada. But Polk understood that there were a lot of northern manufacturers and shippers and logging interests and companies that were interested in the mineral interests in places like the Yukon Territory, in Washington, in Idaho, that there would be tons of gold and silver and copper to be extracted. And this would create a ton of wealth for those northern mining companies. So even though he couldn't have cared less about those areas, because let's face it, Polk's a slaveholder, he supports other slaveholders, and you can't grow cotton or tobacco in Canada. It's just not possible. But he knows we're not going to be bringing slaves up there. But if I support this, if I support going up here and supporting access to these mineral rights for these people, then those northerners are going to support me in what I really want. And what Polk really wanted was the southern parts of the Western Hemisphere. He wanted Mexico. He wanted South America. Okay, so if he can get these people behind him, if he can get all of these Northerners behind him, he'll be able to get all of this stuff in the South. That's his real design in all of this, and we see this pretty blatantly. Polk is not exactly suave in the way he plays all of this stuff. As soon as he's elected in 1844, as soon as he takes office in 1845, one of the first things he does is he arranges a treaty between the United States and Great Britain that establishes the border of the United States and Canada as it is now, that big, straight, long line across the top of those upper north states. Gives up virtually all of Canada, says we're not going after Canada anymore. But Northerners are not going to be angry at him because he did still get the British to cede a ton of territory to the United States. So now a lot of people can look at that and say, we didn't get everything we wanted, but we still got a lot. So, all right, James, tell us what you have in mind. So it's easier for him to do what he really wants here, which was, again, go after the southern parts of the Western Hemisphere. Now, Polk was a candidate that very few people wanted. Polk was the definition of what we in modern politics call a dark horse candidate. I had mentioned to you, I had mentioned him in passing before, that in 1844 there were several candidates for president. The abolitionists, the Liberty Party, had put forth a candidate named James Birney. And that Liberty Party split the Whig vote in states like New York and Michigan, which is what allowed James K. Polk to become the president. And the result of Polk's presidency, the more important result, is not gaining all of that territory in the Pacific Northwest. The bigger issue is the resulting war with Mexico that begins in 1846 and winds up putting the United States on course toward a civil war. Now, this war with Mexico is going to increase the size of the United States by approximately 1/3. So it's a massive chunk of territory that the United States takes. But more importantly, it's going to be the prelude to the American Civil War. 15 years before we get to a civil war, the United States fights Mexico, adds 1 million people to the population. They create a significant growth in that regard, a significant growth in actual territory. For the first time in American history, the United States fights a war entirely outside of its own borders. Also, virtually all of the generals of the Civil War got their first taste of combat and leadership in this war with Mexico. Now, one of the reasons the Civil War was so deadly was that the commanders of the Civil War learned their trade during this war with Mexico when the bayonet was the most important weapon that a soldier had. Soldiers lined up in what were called skirmish lines in a type of war that's called linear warfare. And I talked about linear warfare during the Revolutionary War a little bit, but it's worth pointing out again what it is. You have two groups of soldiers that line up against one another, and they are going to advance toward one another to take the most strategically important piece of land on the battlefield. So theoretically, they're going to be moving closer and closer, but it can also be complicated from the standpoint of one group may be approaching from this direction, another group may be approaching from this direction, but the important piece of land is down here. And this requires this group of soldiers, this opposing group, to move with a tremendous amount of precision and not to lose anybody either, so that they can cut off this other group of soldiers. That means lining up in very strict formation, laying down fire that allows the other guys to advance. Now, ultimately, the hope is that by seizing the strategically important piece of land, the other side will simply abandon the battlefield. But when it doesn't happen that way, when both sides still believe they've got a shot they devolve into close quarters combat, which their muskets are virtually useless. The bayonet becomes the most important part of their accoutrements. They can get in close, they can stab each other. They don't really need to rely on waiting to pour gunpowder down a barrel, ram it all down with the ramrod, put a piece of flint in the firing mechanism and pull it and wait for all of the exploding to happen. The bayonet allows them to continue to fight in close quarters. Now, this is disastrous. It's not disastrous during the war with Mexico, but by the time we get to the American Civil War and we're using much more sophisticated technology in terms of the weaponry, now lining those two lines of soldiers up like this, these two lines of soldiers on opposing sides, and saying, all right, charge at each other to get the most strategically important part, they're just going to be able to mow each other down, and it's going to create lots and lots of death. So these guys are learning a tactic during the war with Mexico that will not serve them well in the next war. Now, the cause, no matter what anybody tells you, the cause, or anybody else tells you, I should say, the cause of this war with Mexico is Texas. Cause of the war with Mexico in 1846 is Texas. Now, why it's the cause of Texas? If we look at maps of Texas today, if you look at this map of Texas, it bears virtually no relation to the borders of Texas today, because in most conceptions on most maps in 1846, this little yellow area here that includes the Sabine River and stretches down to San Antonio and Corpus Christi, that's the extent of Texas. Maps of Texas did not stop at the Rio Grande the way they do today. Okay, and let me just use my little annotation tool here. This this yellow line here is the modern border of Texas. But again, the border in the 1840s, virtually all of the time there, was that area around the Nueces River, around Corpus Christi and the like. This area here is where it extended. That was it. It certainly didn't include any of this territory up into present-day Utah. It certainly didn't extend all the way out like this. This was all disputed territory at this particular moment. Okay? None of that was considered to be Texas. So, when the United States annexes Texas, they say all of that disputed territory plus the yellow territory is Texas. Mexico made it very clear. If you annex Texas with the border at the Rio Grande and claim that all of the disputed territory belongs to you, then a state of war will exist between the U.S. and Mexico. Now, the United States does in fact annex Texas, and they do annex it with the border at the Rio Grande. They don't take this Mexican threat very seriously. And on some level, I don't mean to be disrespectful towards the Mexican government, but there's a reason why the United States didn't take the threat seriously. Polk had actually, as a way to try to stop all of this, quote unquote, had sent negotiators to Mexico to, quote, buy as much of Mexico as possible, and found that there was nobody to negotiate with. Not because Mexican leaders were saying, get the hell out of here, we don't want to sell our country, but because Mexico was presently in the middle of yet another sort of revolution/civil war, and it wasn't clear who was actually in charge. So the United States was relying on that chaos to actually annex Texas with these borders. Now, when the negotiators tell Polk, look, this is a dead issue, we can't find anybody to negotiate with. We certainly can't find anybody who's willing to sell us the country in total. Polk does two things that are designed specifically, three things that are designed specifically to provoke a response from Mexico. The first thing he does is he stations the United States Navy off the coast of California and the east coast of Mexico. I'm going to take a quick step back here and go back to that map for a second. He's going to put the Navy out on the west coast of California and into the Gulf of Mexico in places like right outside of Tampico and Veracruz. Okay, so that's where the U.S. Navy is going to be sent. The Navy will, or the Department of the Navy will also send a contingent of Marines into California with the idea that they will foment revolution. They know, or at least Polk believes, that there are people who are very upset with the Mexican government in California, and all they're waiting for is leadership, and Polk's going to give them that leadership. So they are there. The Marines are there to help foment a revolution, particularly amongst Anglos in California. And then the last thing he's going to do is he's going to send an army under General Zachary Taylor, whose painting appears here on the board. Taylor is going to be sent with an 8,000-man force to Corpus Christi with, again, the goal of provoking an attack. And again, I'm going to come back here in a second. I want to go to our map for a minute and show you how Mexico plays what Taylor is going to do. Polk tells Taylor to set up right at Corpus Christi, right here at Corpus Christi, where I've circled. Now, he's told, do not invade, don't move forward, just sit there in Corpus Christi. The Mexican government will see the presence of 8,000 soldiers massed across the border. They won't have any choice but to attack. They'll have to respond. It turns out Mexico says, we're not going to do anything here. So, Taylor is ordered by Polk to cross into the disputed territory. This tells him, go into and invade the disputed territory. So come right into that area that is marked by the brown area here. Just come in here. Taylor still gets no response from the Mexican army. Everybody assumed that as soon as the United States crossed into this sort of no man's land, that again, Mexico would have no choice. They'd have to attack. So, Polk's now furious and tells Taylor, all right, that's it. I want you to go down to the border area to Matamoros, and I want you to launch an invasion via Matamoros. Now, what Taylor is going to do is he's going to come down right across the Rio Grande from Matamoros. He's going to set up a camp called Fort Brown. And Fort Brown will be the basis for the future city of Brownsville. And he's going to use that as the base to attack Matamoros. And he does. He crosses the Rio Grande River, goes into Mexico, and attacks Mexico via Matamoros. Now, this is a huge problem. This issue of going in across the Rio Grande is a massive problem because Taylor, by going into Matamoros, has crossed the boundary into Mexico by the United States' definition. Now, think about why that's important. According to the Mexican government, all of the disputed territory should actually belong to the Mexican government. It shouldn't belong to the United States. So Mexico would have actually been within their rights from an international law perspective to defend their right to that disputed territory. But they didn't. They waited for the United States to violate according to the United States' position before they fight back. And they fight back. They wind up kicking Taylor's butt. They wind up sending these soldiers running back on a very hasty retreat to Corpus Christi. And it's at this point that James K. Polk goes before the Congress and asks them for a declaration of war. And listen to the words that he uses when he asks for this declaration of war. Even though there's no doubt that the United States had gone into the disputed territory and then gone into Mexican territory proper, Polk says, quote, Mexico has passed the boundary of the United States, has invaded our territory, and shed American blood upon American soil. She has proclaimed that hostilities have commenced and that the two nations are now at war. Now, the soldiers that he claims were attacked on, quote, American soil were those soldiers that Taylor had sent in through Matamoros who were retreating back through the disputed territory. And to a lot of congressmen, this sounded like a BS story. And one of the congressmen, made no bones about his disbelief of what Polk was saying. And he proposed something called the spot resolution. Now, this spot resolution was going to require Polk to personally come to Congress, to appear before Congress, literally with maps, and answer some questions. The first question would be, are the people living in that region, the people who are living in the disputed territories, are they people who have ever submitted to U.S. authority or not? And this person, this congressman who's doing this, is a lawyer. He's a very well-known lawyer in his home state at this point. And like all good lawyers, you don't ask questions that you don't know the answers to. So he knew the answer to this. He knew that these people had never submitted to U.S. authority. The second question was whether these people who were killed, the American blood shed on American soil, were they, quote, citizens, were they civilians, or were they soldiers who had been sent there by the orders of the president? Now, the last provision, and why it got called the spot resolution, was that Polk would literally have to show the exact spot on a map where, quote, American blood had been shed on, quote, American soil. Now, it's a resolution, and there's a reason why I'm calling it the spot resolution. It's because it goes to the full House of Representatives, and it gets voted down easily. It loses. This congressman loses this fight, and Polk is excused from answering any questions about this. Now, the congressman, incidentally, also believed that this was the singular failure of his life. He thought, there is no way I will ever recover from the dishonor of this. He even wrote in his diary that he was, quote, consigned to political oblivion, never to be heard from again. And he actually went home and did not even seek re-election because he knew there was no way he was going to win. And he just accepted that I'm done in politics. And he was slightly wrong. The congressman was a first-term congressman from Illinois named Abraham Lincoln, and he became quite a bit more successful and more famous as a consequence of all of this. Now, the Mexican War, though, this protest notwithstanding, the Mexican War literally begins with a bold-faced lie. Polk said Mexico had declared war. Didn't happen. Refused to sell their territory, which was, to him incredibly offensive, but to virtually anybody with a brain, it kind of makes sense that you don't just go out and sell your territory. But opponents of this war looked at this in other ways. They didn't look at it from the standpoint of declaring war or refusal to sell land. One senator called it a, quote, immoral land grab. And then another one added, a senator from Delaware added, quote, ordering Taylor to the Rio Grande was as much an act of war as pointing a pistol at another man's breast. Abolitionists looked at this and said the massive amounts of territory that we stand to gain from Mexico will do a lot to expand the empire of slavery, so to speak. There will be tons of land that will be useful under the institution of slavery. That aside, this war was incredibly popular. There was a call for 75,000 volunteers, and the United States got 150,000 volunteers. So it just was an incredibly popular war in that regard. Now, as soon as this war breaks out, a rebellion was declared. A rebellion broke out in California as planned, as I talked about a few minutes ago. Troops wound up being sent into New Mexico to siege Santa Fe and to remove the governor of Santa Fe. Within a matter of about 8 weeks, the United States had concluded the conquest of the entirety of what is today the continental United States. The United States had forced a surrender of Mexican officials in all of these areas as far west as California. However, the Mexican government refused to surrender in the war, and because the Mexican government refused to surrender, insurgencies broke out in all of these other places, like Santa Fe, New Mexico, like Los Angeles, California, like San Francisco, or where San Francisco, California would be located. These were all hot spots of insurgencies. As you can see on the board here, we've got the military governor of New Mexico, who was a U.S. military officer. He's assassinated. There are fights all across this area. And the United States wound up ultimately calling even more of those volunteer troops in to suppress all of this so that because they would have a superior numerical advantage in all of this. And yet, as all of it gets suppressed, as the United States winds up exerting control over all of these areas, Mexico still refuses to surrender. So Polk concludes that the only way this is going to work, the only way Mexico will surrender, is if the United States actually directly invades Mexico proper, quote unquote. And when I say that, what I mean is what makes up Mexico today. This is the area that Polk is saying we've got to invade this area. So he sends another massive army. This one, 10,000 men under a general named Winfield Scott. Scott is ordered to Veracruz, Mexico, Veracruz on the Gulf Coast. His men are going to put in at Veracruz and march overland to Mexico City. Now, you can get an idea just by seeing on the board here the dates that they land at Veracruz in March of 1847, and they make it to Mexico City in September of 1847. They are on the march for 6 months, and it's not just because they encounter heavy fighting. They do. They encounter incredibly heavy fighting along the way, but it's also just, again, we'll come back to this in a second. I'm going to go back to that map for a second. This is an incredibly long march from Veracruz to Mexico City. It's a huge march. So these guys are doing this while they're fighting their way to Mexico City. And ultimately, what winds up happening is Winfield Scott and his men do actually make it into Mexico City. They wind up gaining control, and they wind up defeating, quote unquote, the Mexican military. However, again, the Mexican government still refuses to surrender. By now, Santa Anna has re-seized power, and he's the one who's putting up the resistance. Now, Santa Anna had actually played the United States. Santa Anna told the U.S. State Department, if you help me get into power, I will sell you all of the territory you've been talking about. And when Santa Anna gets into power, he turns on the United States and refuses to sell them and sell land to them, and actually reinforces the position of the rebels. So this rebellion continues, and that's kind of what made Polk conclude we have to invade Mexico. So house-to-house fighting ensues. This becomes very much like a modern war in terms of an internal insurgency and these people fighting the United States military simply as a way of saying we're going to harass you and inflict casualties on you and make it so bad here that you conclude it's not worth it. They're attacking from rooftops. These insurgents and rebels are attacking supply trains and all of this stuff. And the United States fights this brutally. They kill soldiers, they kill civilians, they refuse to accept typical safe spaces, if you will. For example, churches were always considered to be off limits, but the United States said if we find out that rebels are hiding out in a church, we're not going to simply say, oh, it's a church, it's off limits. We're going to break down the doors and we're going to arrest everybody and take them out. A group of Irish immigrants were so angry about this that they actually defected from the U.S. side to the Mexican side in this war and began referring to themselves, instead of the St. Patrick's Brigade, they began referring to themselves as the San Patricio Brigade, as a way of saying we just don't agree with the United States on all of this issue. Now, Polk has a problem. As all of this plays out, the United States suppresses all of this stuff. They wind up defeating the rebels in all of these places, and Polk has a victory, so to speak, but he still does not have a signed peace treaty. And he needs that in order for the Democratic Party to hold on to power. He needs that peace treaty. Now, Polk is not concerned about himself. Polk had promised, I'm only going to serve one term and then I'm gone. And he did not bother to run for president in 1848. So he was a man of his word on that regard. But there was a Democrat running to replace him, and Polk wanted to be able to hand off to him. And Polk knew, I need a peace treaty. Now, he had sent a negotiator named Nicholas Trist to Mexico City with Winfield Scott. And as he was there longer and he got to know Winfield Scott, Nicholas Trist was convinced that Winfield Scott was a better person than James K. Polk. So ultimately, Polk said, I don't want Nicholas Trist negotiating this treaty. I don't trust him anymore. And he actually recalls him. Now, he does this even though Nicholas Trist had found people to negotiate with, had actually concluded a treaty which became the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. And when it was presented to Congress, Congress looked at this, the Senate looks at it and said, I don't understand. This is all of the territory that you initially wanted. You're holding out because Mexico won't give you the rest of Mexico? This doesn't make sense. Let's end this. Polk persisted in saying, I want Nicholas Trist recalled. And the problem was the letter to recall Nicholas Trist never got to him. So ultimately, while waiting for this to happen, while waiting for Trist to come back and send a new negotiator down and negotiate a whole new treaty and all of that, the Senate simply ratified the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. And Polk, since it was his treaty, he wound up having to accept it. So this Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo ends the war with Mexico, and it allows the United States to annex, with the approval of the Mexican government, they annex the rest of present-day Texas, all of New Mexico, all of present-day Arizona, all of present-day Colorado, all of present-day Nevada, all of present-day California, parts of Utah. So the continental empire, so to speak, has now been completed. It's a strange treaty in another way. The Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo stipulated that anyone who remained, any of these people who were Mexicanos and people who were previously Mexican citizens, if they remained in the United States, their property rights were to be respected. But more importantly, they would be granted U.S. citizenship. And why I mention that is that it hasn't happened yet, but it's about to in the Supreme Court. The United States Supreme Court is about to define citizenship define whiteness as a component of citizenship. So when these people who are Mexican citizens are brought into the United States and they're told you are to be citizens, there's an understanding of a classification of whiteness for these people. And that is going to be a very important factor in these people's lives if you take 1302. So whether you take it with, if you take it with me, you're going to hear about it in 1302. If you don't take it with me, ask your 1302 professor about why the whiteness of these Mexicanos became an issue. If you haven't heard about it by the time they get to the 1970s, if you haven't heard them talk about it, ask them why this is an issue. So this war becomes an incredibly important war, and the questions over what will the role of slavery be in all of this new territory becomes the thing that's going to push the United States headlong into a civil war by 1861. All right, that wraps up Lecture 15. When we come back with Lecture 16, we're going to be dealing with the aftermath of the war with Mexico. We'll see you then.